I think we should start now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back again. Now this week we are at online session 5, already halfway. And I would like to thank, for everyone's commitment to participate in the training. As we go on every week like that, I know I understand that it's not easy for those who have a full-time job and workload. So I'm just thankful for your commitment. And today we have Dr. Nicole George. She will lead the session today on innovative research, and in which I personally find it very interesting myself. I'm very curious when I see the sessions, and I really want to know, even though I have done quite a number of years of research, but my research experience also very limited in my field, in legal research, and I try to use social science research method. So this is also a good opportunity for me to learn as well, and I'm sure for others as well. Research methodology, I think it's we always learn, we always share, because we are always from different discipline. So that's why it's this training is very good for everyone, to learn from each other and to learn new methodology, especially. And yeah, I don't have any other thing to say besides handing the floor to Nicole, and she will, she seemed to be she seemed to can't wait, to share, her own research project with this new methodology with us. Yeah. Okay. So,
Okay, thanks.
Nicole, the floor is to you now. Yeah.
Sorry, Kim-san, I jumped in there a little too early. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. So great to be with you all again. Sorry, I had a couple of weeks break. I let the two other members of our team, Kirill and DB, take the floor for a couple of weeks, but I'm back here with you again today, and I'm really excited to see you all online. So thank you for making your time. As Kim-san said, we know you are really busy people, so I hope you will find the session today interesting, which as Kim-san said, we're going to be discussing innovative research methods today, and I'm going to be sharing with you my own experience in working with innovative methods. And we might do a little group exercise to just help us think about why innovative methods are important. I've already had a really great question about, the robustness of innovative research methods. So I'm going to come back to that question as we go through the slides, because I think it's a really important provocation. But I guess I would just start by saying, I think sometimes if we design our research carefully, we can develop innovative research methods and make the case that our research might be more robust than standard research methods too. So that's my provocation to you today, is that good research design can be innovative, and also be more robust sometimes than standard research methods. So, but that depends on the context. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this now. What I shall do is share my screen, of course. So let me do that now. I hope you can see it okay. And let me go to... Is that showing all right? I just need to go to...
Full screen?
Yeah, full screen. Thanks, Marnie. That's what I'm trying to do. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay. So I need to. Okay, is that showing okay now for everyone? Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
Great. Terrific. All right. So what I'm going to share with you is, as I said, a discussion on innovative research methods. But my case study is a study of gender and gendered security and gendered experiences of gendered insecurity in the research context I work in, which is the Pacific Islands, right? But the principles that I'm discussing apply across many different types of social science research. So what I'm aiming to do with our discussion today is to think about how we can conduct research, social science research, and it doesn't have to be on gender. My work is on gender, but if we're interested in, like, our broad aim with this project that we're doing together is inclusive social science research. How do we do inclusive social science research? And how do we work with groups of people, or how do we work in a way in social science research that we try to capture the voices and the experiences of as broad a group of people as we can, right? So I have gender there, how to demonstrate how research on gender can involve more than just interviews and focus groups. But I guess what I would say to you is to demonstrate how inclusive research can involve more than just interviews and focus groups. So a lot of work that we do in social science is interview-based work, focus group-based work, or survey-based work. And I'm going to talk about the challenges of working with these type of methodologies if we want to do inclusive research. And so part of what is motivating this work with you today is to sort of get us thinking beyond the standard research methodologies, but also to think about the importance of ensuring that our research is designed with ethical principles in the front of our minds. So there is also, if we're working and we're trying to work with inclusively, we need to also think about ethical research practice. So we're going to talk more about ethics later on in a couple of weeks' time. I'm going to lead a session on ethics. However, I also want to introduce the idea of ethical research conduct and introducing ethical principles into our research design here today. I'm going to explain all of this more, so don't worry if you're not following at the moment. And as I said, what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through all these ideas in reference to a study that I have led. I've just completed it, actually. I've finally got the book coming out from this research in literally in August, in about a month's time. I wish I had a copy so I could show you, but I can show you the cover in a bit. But this will be the completion of this work that I've done using an innovative research method. And the method I'm using is called photo elicitation. It's a visual research method. And I'm going to talk to you about how, if you're interested in this idea, you could probably, you can do it quite simply with your own, with the means that are accessible to you as well. Okay. So let me start by sort of posing a question, and that is, why might we be, or I would say, why should we be interested in innovative research methods? And one of the things that I think is important is to understand that while we have those standard research methodologies in social science research, like interviews, like focus group discussions, or like surveys, they all have limitations, right? They don't tell us everything that we need to know about our research field. So let's talk about the limitations of interviews. Now, I do interviews. Everybody does interviews. Interviews are an important way of gathering data. but we also need to be aware that they have limitations. So they will tell us some things about our research project, or they'll provide us with some answers to our research question, but they won't tell us everything. Why is that? Well, we all know that in all conversations, there are things we tell people and there are things that we withhold, right? And if we don't know the people that we're interviewing terribly well, they may tell us some things in answer to our question, but there might be a lot that they actually withhold, that they don't tell. They might do that because they don't know us well. They might actually, where there's a strong sort of difference between communities, say, for example, I, as a white Australian woman, went to Cambodia and tried to conduct research with women who are market vendors in a rural market somewhere in Cambodia. And maybe I brought along an interpreter, and maybe they saw me with my notebook, or, maybe I would have an iPad or something like that. They're immediately going to see me as in a certain way. Maybe they don't trust me. Maybe they want to please me. And so they answer a question in the way that they think I might want to hear, the answer I might want to hear. They want to please me. They want to share information that makes them feel happy. If you give, often what we do with social science research, and particularly when we're working with in economically disadvantaged communities, we might give people a little bit of money to say thank you for their participation or to pay them for their time, or we might buy a drink or a snack or something like that for them. And so they feel they've got to earn, they feel they've got to earn that gift. And so they may, again, be sort of sharing information that is not necessarily what they think, but what they think the researcher wants to hear. So, it's sad, but often that is the case, that people don't trust their own knowledge. So there's an issue of trust between you and the people you're working with when you're doing your research, whether they might be worried about sharing sensitive information, or they may not want to tell you things that are their own personal experiences because they don't trust you, or they're trying to please you. And the other thing is also that we may actually, when we're working cross-culturally, the questions that we pose may not be understood by the people that we're asking, that we're trying to interview as well. I would say this is also the same for survey data. When we're collecting surveys, it's actually, we assume that surveys are easy to fill out, but they're easy to fill out if you're literate. They're not easy to fill out if reading and writing are not things you do all the time. So for very many communities, it may actually be really hard to fill out a survey. And, often surveys are way too long. People don't have enough time to complete them, so they complete them as quickly as possible. I'm guilty of that. I get sent surveys all the time for the university, wanting to understand what I think about certain parts of how this organization operates. And I'm also, I'm doing them as fast as I can, often with the bare minimum of information, because I'm like, this is like, the 10th thing on the list of things that I have to get through today. So time constraints are also part of the problem. But linguistic constraints, I would say, too, are often underestimated. Even in Australia, working with different kinds of communities, if you don't word your questions in interviews or your survey questions well, they can often be misunderstood, or people just, they don't engage in a really serious way with the things with, the type of questions we're posing them. I should say, if anyone has anything they want to ask, please do. And I know Moani will be looking at the chat. So if you want to put your comments in the chat, please do as we go along. Moani, don't hesitate to interrupt me if there's anything that you feel like should be brought to my attention, or if people are putting questions in. I'm more than happy for this to be interactive. I just can't see everybody. So I can't see hands go up if people are putting their hands up. So just if you can put your comments in the chat, and Moani will let me know if someone's got a question, and we'll call on you to ask that question. Another sort of very standard research strategy for social science research is focus group discussion. And focus group discussion can be really great. It can be very important, particularly when you're trying to feel your way with a field of study, a preliminary project or something. And it's nice to see people working through answers together in a focus group. You pose a general question, and it's interesting to see and record how the discussion evolves amongst group members. However, we also know that focus group discussion has some limitations as a research methodology. And that relates again to social dynamics in a way. If there are people in the group that expect to be deferred to because of their age, because of their class, because of maybe, racialized or ethnic divisions in a community, then they may expect to dominate the discussion. And other members of the group may be more reluctant to share their views in that discussion. We also know if the gender dynamics of the group are not carefully thought about, the similar things can happen. Sometimes women who have things to say may defer to men in the group. Sometimes younger women may feel very reluctant to speak if there are older, more, men of status in the group as well. And these group dynamics can mean that people tend then, sometimes focus group discussions can sort of take on what I would call a kind of group think dynamic, where the ideas of some dominate the discussion and dominate the response that the group develops in response to a question that's asked of them. And there are other members of the group that don't feel comfortable sharing their opinions, even if those challenge the most vocal members. Okay. Everyone following along okay? So there's some things that we can do to get around this. Some other things, how could I put this? Some other strategies if we're doing interviews or we're doing focus group discussion is to engage with what I would call passive observation. Now, passive observation is the idea that everything that you're doing in the lead up to engaging in an interview or conducting an interview or getting a group together for a focus group actually is part of the research. So it's an important way of, I've got the term there, triangulation. It helps us triangulate our findings. So for example, if I go, and this has been my experience, researching gender violence in the Pacific Islands region, I have often interviewed police officers who may be the head of a particular unit that's focused on family safety and the regulation of family safety. And when you speak to them, they tell you that they're doing everything they can to make the laws of the country accessible to women who may be exposed to that violence. So they respond to all the complaints that they hear about or that are brought to their attention. They show me around their office. They show me the kind of infrastructure that they have, and they're often very proud about it. And they tell you, very easily, it would be easy to take away the impression that they are on top of their job and they're doing a great job through what they say to me, because they want to report, they want me to report that they're doing a great job. However, it's also been my experience when you go into those teams, often, this is not everywhere, but it's certainly been my experience sometimes when I do those interviews, that actually, there's 10 desks maybe, and there's only 1 or 2 people in the office. That the office itself is, in a tiny corner of the whole police building, that it's actually, it would seem to be quite under-resourced in comparison to other areas of policing responsibility and other offices that are part of the police bureau. So what I'm suggesting there is you can take away one impression from what you're told by people, but passive observation, when you just look around and use your powers of observation, you can see other things. You can record other sorts of information that help you triangulate what you're being told by the person who participates in the interview. I hope that makes sense to people. If it doesn't, please put something in the chat and we can talk about it more, or I'll stop in a minute and just make sure everyone's everyone's following along, and if anyone's got questions. So we can look at the surroundings, the environment in which the interview is taking place. We can maybe record nonverbal communication too. If people seem unsure, often I've had the experience where when you ask somebody who's responsible for policy implementation about what they're doing, they may tell you they're doing a really good job, but if they seem hesitant about the policy, then it's also, or they take a while to get into the flow, or they seem really nervous. These are kind of non-verbal cues that, maybe everything is not quite as it seems. And it's important to think about how these things might confirm what you're told in an interview, or they might contradict what you've been told in an interview. I don't think you necessarily, and I never have, raised these things with people that I've interviewed. I don't sort of say, oh, you seem really nervous about when I ask you about policy, what does that tell me? I would never raise that, but I think it's important just to take those notes because it helps you, again, triangulate what you're being told. So passive observation is one way that we can triangulate some of those challenges. However, sometimes the research that we're doing might require us, and particularly, as I said earlier, if we're interested in inclusive research, sometimes we also need to think about how we can work and the kinds of research methodologies that we can develop that really focus on ethical principles of conducting, how to conduct research ethically, and especially how to conduct research that we don't, that we minimize the risks, I guess. So I want to go through some of the risks that can be associated with research and to think about why standard research processes may help us get some way in terms of the information that we're going to gather as part of our research, and may help us manage some of the ethical challenges. But we can also do a bit more with our research design to navigate these things in more creative ways. And I would argue to maybe get more robust information. So to manage some of those limitations I've already discussed. So for me, yes.
We got a couple of comments here in the box regarding the nonverbal responses. So the first question is about how can we report those on nonverbal responses? And the second one is on how can we include passive observation in our analysis? And last, could you elaborate more on how you triangulate information data we collect?
Sure.
Coming in, sorry. When we incorporate our fieldwork notes with our interview data, how can we treat this data in analysis? Is this for additional reporting writing, or is this to be also coded? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great questions. All right, so I'm just having a look at those now. So a couple of them are asking the same thing. How do we report those nonverbal responses? So I think what we can do there so keep them as notes is the important thing, right? So keep your interview data as your transcripts, and then write up your passive observations as well. And then I think you can code those in the same way that you code your interview data. So you code your interview data, what are the key themes, right? But then think about, okay, what other information did I gather that was not spoken information? And you can write this up. When you're writing up your data, you can say, well, I was told this. However, I also observed this. And I think that is totally legitimate to sort of contrast what you have been told by a set of people in interviews, and then to consider, in fact, I think this adds to the richness and depth of the research. Then you can say, while I was told this, by a certain group of actors, you know, police officers responsible for policing gender violence or policing women's security. At the same time, I also observed XYZ. I also observed that there were no police vehicles. So there was, you know, there was no way of a police person being able to travel further than walking distance to investigate a claim, for example. So I think that's robust and important information that actually gives a fuller picture and adds to the richness of the data that you're collecting. So and in your research methodology, you can write up your interview strategy, the way in which you've selected your interview participants, but you can also add that you triangulated the data collected in this way with what we call passive observation, which is a recognized methodology. Does that answer those questions?
Yeah, we got a couple of thumbs up.
Thank you so much.
Thumbs up. Great, great.
And just an additional question, would the observation be the biased information as it depends on our subjective judgment?
Yes, I was looking at that question too. Well, I mean, I think all the kinds of methodologies that I'm talking about are interpretive methodologies, okay? So, is it biased judgment to say there's no police cars at a particular police agency? I mean, maybe we would ask a question about, oh, do you have access to a police car if you observe that there is no police car, right? So, you know, you can ask a question about that, or you could ask a follow-up question later on, or you could email about that. But, you know, I think it is, in fact, I would say it is perhaps more robust to balance out what you are being told in an interview and the data you code from an interview, to balance that out with the things that you observe visually as well. You know, it's interesting that we sort of imagine that some particular types of data are more robust than others. We're talking about interpretive research here, and we're talking about coding. So as long as you explain your coding strategy, both in terms of how you code your interview data, but also then how you're coding your observation data, then I think it is absolutely legitimate to include that data, as long as you're transparent about how you're gathering those findings. Yeah. And you might say, I mean, the other thing to do is you can write up those findings and also suggest that there's some limitation, but it's a point of interest. So, for example, you might say, I noted at the major police station there was no police vehicle, which suggested to me that even while the police were confident in their capacity, there is maybe some some resourcing challenges that mean they can only investigate cases within a certain jurisdiction of the police station. However, I didn't conduct similar observations in other police stations around the country, so I don't know how widespread this is. Do you see what I mean? We're adding in some illustration here, but we're not necessarily saying, okay, we're going to generalize everywhere. I think honestly that this is this is really rich data, and it adds nuance to the story that you're telling. And I would say, or to your evaluation of the data, and it adds robustness, I would say. That's my personal opinion.
May I share something as well?
Yes, Kim-san, please
Nicole?
do.
Yeah, I find it very interesting, and it's also, that's what I compared it to, like a witness testimony in the courtroom.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because the goal for research is to get down to the truth, factual information, right? And sometimes we cannot trust the people that provide interview. You know, we even cannot trust, you know, the witness that provide testimony, evidence, you know, to the judge. That's why they have the crime of perjury. If you lie to the judge, you're gonna be punished and sentenced up to 5 years. even that, even with this legal threat, some witness still lie to the judge, right? So, uh, so I think it's very interesting because it gives you more context, to the answers, and although but you can just tell the reader, uh, and let the reader judge by themselves that you are providing
Exactly.
additional context. This is what I see. This is what I observe. The environment, the demeanor, the etiquette
Yes.
of the interviewee, because in court testimony, the judge always observe the character, the demeanor, the attitude, the behavior of people who testify before them, because the idea is to get down to the truth, and that is the purpose of the research. We investigate, we question because we want to understand as much as possible. So I think as long as we tell the reader how we do it, like you mentioned, Nico, I think it's okay. It can be subjective because we observe it, but it is the reader who make decision on that, whether they want to believe in our extra context that we give them, or not. Yeah. So my first job was a trial monitor of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. I listened to the court. I listened to the proceeding for almost 2 years, and I had to write the monitoring report. And part of that, we have one sections that I need to analyze the demeanor etiquette, courtroom etiquette, demeanor of the witness, the accused persons. So if I write the legal part, I only mention what they actually say. But in the other part, I also need to analyze and write down what they actually behave, if the witness, when providing testimony, they crying or not, they feel pressure or not, they feel anxious or not, whether their answer are collaborative with other information or not, and yeah, I can compare to, in the legal field like that.
Thank you. Wow, that's a pretty high stakes environment, I think, for to be engaging in participant observation. But you've really made a great case for thinking about why it's important. And a really context specific, an example that's very contextually important for the history of Cambodia. So thank you so much, Kim Sun, for sharing that. Yeah, I'd love to talk more when we meet up in person to learn about that experience that you've had. I mean, that, as I said, that's a hugely high stakes example of why this kind of observation it can be so important. What I was thinking about when you first started talking was that, not every interview is so high stakes. And, I guess you don't want to be in a position where you're starting to think of yourself as a judge sometimes either, and looking for holes in what people say. My sense sometimes is people share with you the truth that is theirs, right? They have their truth. And so I don't know that, I don't want to come across as thinking everybody's deceiving when they answer an interview question. That's not what I'm sort of saying. But sometimes their truth, Kim Sun said we need to get to the truth. And that's really hard as a researcher because everyone has their own truth in a way. So objectively, what is the truth? Sometimes it's going to be really hard for us to understand what is the truth, and we're balancing up all these different accounts of who, people's truths. And so passive observation just gives us a bit more information to help us balance up what might be very contending and different perspectives of what, the truth is, because everybody potentially has their own vision of the truth. But thanks, Kim Sun. That's hugely interesting and intervention and really helpful here. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about risk. Sometimes we're going to be investigating really sensitive things. I mean, Kim Sun's work sounds like hugely sensitive, a very high stakes environment, right? The work that I've done has been focused on, and this research case study that I want to talk about has been focused on researching gender violence, right? In communities, Pacific Island communities, and many parts of the world where people don't want to talk about it, right? It's like a stigma. It's often a source of shame for those who are exposed to the violence as well as those who perpetrate the violence. And so often what we find is, and I would say probably in most communities around the world, while this violence is very prevalent, it's prevalent here in Australia, prevalent all around the world, people don't want to talk about it because they're ashamed or they're fearful. Women who share those stories might be fearful they're going to be in for more violence from their own family members or from their community. Or as I said, it's a source of stigma. So when we're doing work in these kind of areas, we have to be very, very careful. The other thing is if we're working on this issue, gender violence is hugely traumatic to experience. So if we're going to be doing this work, we don't want to be doing it in a way that exposes those who've been exposed to violence to more trauma, right? So we have all these different kinds of risks attached to this kind of research. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all need to do this kind of research. It's research that I've been doing for a long time. I'm really interested in trying to create a world that is more gender just, and I think this is one of the big challenges. So I do this work, but just because you have a very noble ambition to make the lives of women safe doesn't mean you can do this work and not think about the ethics of what you're doing and the risks that you might be doing things that expose people to harm if you're trying to do social science research on this program. And if we do that in this area or in any area, if we expose research participants to risk, then we are contravening principles of human ethics research, right? As I said, we're going to talk more about this a bit later in the next sessions, but I just wanted to introduce this idea now because that's one of the reasons why I've been working in the way that I do. All right. Okay. So how about we just stop for a minute and I've got here, imagine you're developing a research project on, I've got here gender insecurity in your community, but maybe it doesn't have to be that. Maybe it's just a social science question that you're interested in, or some kind of research project about human experience. And think about, okay, say you had some idea that you wanted to investigate. It might even be something like the rising cost of living at the moment, or people's ability to find work, or how people dealt with the impacts of COVID. That might be a good one, right? Because that's in our minds. So think about that and then just think about some of the risks that might be attached to doing that work. And we might just write down 2 or 3. Think about what a research project might be that you could conduct in your community, whether that be your workplace, whether that be your where you live, a social setting amongst your group of friends, and think about 3 risks that might be attached to that work. Just so we start thinking about, oh, what is it? What does it mean to talk about risk and research? Because we often don't put those 2 things together, but I think it is quite important for us if we're doing research design and we want to conduct research ethically, then we need to start thinking about those things. So why don't we take 10 minutes, and we won't be able to go around to everyone because there's a big number of us, but we might just see if there are people in the group that want to share their ideas. So let's take 10 minutes to think of just a broad research question and where and how it might generate risks, either for the participants or for you as the researcher. And if you're unclear what you need to do, please just put a question in the chat or or let me know. We'll come back at, what's the time? How are we going? I feel like we're taking a lot of time and I've got a lot of slides to get through. So we'll reconvene maybe at about 5 to 11.
5 to 11. Yeah. I'm
Is
gonna
that okay,
split
everyone?
in- Yeah, we got 25 participants, so I'm gonna split in 5 groups. Yeah.
Oh, you're going to put them in groups. Okay.
Oh,
Wani,
sorry.
okay.
Do you prefer them to walk individually or like, yeah?
No, maybe, yeah, groups will be fine. Let's put everyone into 5 groups.
Yeah.
That might be easier. Thanks, Moani. So if you can all join those groups, please, that would be great. Oh, it looks like they have. Okay. I was thinking that people haven't joined, but most have. Okay, great. Thanks, Moani. Sorry, I should have given you a bit of a heads up there.
Oh, that's fine. It is quick here. Everything is automatic here.
Well, Kim-san, that must have been quite a job. How were you a young person doing that work? Great. Maybe I'll stop sharing so I can just see people a bit better because we can't really see each other at the moment, can we? Might be easier. I'll come back to sharing. Okay, so we had 5 groups. I hope people can remember which group they were, but maybe we could call on some of the participants to just share any ideas they had or any thoughts in response to that question. Maybe just describe what you were thinking about as a research project and what some possible risks might be. How shall I do this? Does anyone remember who was in group 1?
We got someone nominate somebody here.
Oh,
That's group
fantastic.
2. Yeah. Maybe group 2 can start if you're happy.
Sure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Ratha, for forcefully nominate me without my knowledge, apparently. Okay, so we were discussing about researching on the perspective of parents and guardian of those who approve of child marriage.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great.
So like according to my experience when I think about this topic, it was very hard for us to, because one of the issues is that we cannot find parents and guardian who actually come forward to say, look, I approve of my child marriage. And we know the associated risk with that. That's why people would not come up and claim that status. One of the risk is about the legal risk, because child marriage is illegal, actually, even those according to Cambodian law, up to, I think, up to like 15 or 16, 17, the guardian and parents can actually approve of that, of that status. And so it's one of the risks is the legal issue.
Yeah.
The other risk is about the cultural sensitivity, because the respondent may face judgment and discrimination if they come forward and join in our research. And the other risk also, we could compromise the identity of that child who, because there might be the community may not know that they got married in such a young age. But if we do the research and interview the parents and guardian, the community may now know that this person actually got married underage. It also the risk of exposing the partner, the spouse as well, because the spouse can also be a child, or the spouse can also be a person who married to a child, which
Yes.
would become like a pedophile in this case.
Yeah.
So we're exposing that person as a pedophile. For our own safety as well, as a researcher who go to a community and start kind of deconstructing this cultural norm that they have, for instance, may also put us in a position against the backlash, cultural backlash. And
Yes.
people would not be very welcoming for us to do so. We may also unveil some of the traumatized even in people's life, which we need to be aware of. So it's more on we need to think about a trauma-informed practice in this case, because we may encounter the traumatic experience. Yeah. I think that is all from our group too.
Beautiful. Thank you. What a lovely way of thinking through, and such an interesting issue that you've identified, but a very nice way of thinking through what the risks are. Well done. That was lovely. I mean, lovely. That sounds the wrong word to say in relation to such a challenging issue, but you've done a really nice job there. So thank you so much for sharing. Is there another group that would like to share their experiences or their thoughts?
Lina, you may want to share your domestic violence
Yes, of course,
research
ma'am.
related, because it's kind of similar to what they is sharing.
Yes, of course, ma'am. So we are in group number 4. So in our group, we discuss about my previous experience in conducting a study related to GBV. So from my experience, so before we conduct we go to the site, so we got like the approval from the local authority, and also like all the people that they involved in this study. So we got the permission in advance, and we also consider about the risk of participants that involved in the study, especially the victim of GBVs, because we don't want them like to get more risk, especially like more violence from the perpetrators.
Yeah.
So we also seek to get their consents and anonymize all the information that can identify the person. And also, in my experience, we also seek to be really considerate about some question that can bring more trauma experience, and also provide them any support that they need, maybe like counseling, the expert related to counseling that they may need the supports. And also regarding researchers, for researcher, when we receive the question, when we ask participants, we also may like experience some emotionals, some emotional from participant as well. So we consider that in advance. So there are support services available for researcher that they may need some support regarding this. Moreover, going to the field in a new location, so we try to think of a gender balance between male and female researchers, so then we can support one another, not only female in a new location, and we try to leave the community before it gets dark.
Yeah, great. This is excellent. So this is based on your own personal experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Look, we're running a bit out of time, but maybe we'll just try. Thank you so much. Really great discussion of those issues. Could we just try, and they cross over a lot with what I'm going to talk about in a minute, so thanks for that. maybe just one more group. If there was another group that had something they wanted to share, I don't want to sort of deprive everybody of the right, but unfortunately we're running a bit out of time. Maybe we can come back to this when we're in person together in August. If there's no one jumping out, maybe I'll continue with your permission. Would that be okay? Yeah, okay. Yes, okay. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Thank you. All right, let me go back to sharing again. Where am I? Is this the one I was doing? Yes. Okay, I hope you can all see. All right. Okay, so let me continue. So, with my own question, sorry, I'm just lost my page a little bit now. Let me go back. So I was doing, like our colleague, also wanting to, as I said, do some research on gender violence. And let me just share, and this was in Pacific Island countries. So 3 countries, all those dynamics that everyone is talking about were pertinent to my own research experience as well. So let me share my first, remember we talked about SMART research questions earlier in our program of study together. So my 2 SMART research questions for this project were, in fact, my 3 SMART research questions were, 1, how is the principle that women have a human right to security from gender violence institutionalized in each country context? So the one thing I didn't tell you is the 3 places I was doing this work: Fiji, Bougainville, New Caledonia. So 3 Pacific Island countries. So that my first question. My second question, what meaning do women attach to the institutions that regulate their safety? And then what work do women do to achieve safety from violence? And that was really related to question number 3. How do women manage situations where they experience insecurity from gender-based violence? So that were my 3 sort of different sets of questions. The first question that I sought to answer, I did policy evaluation. So basically what I did was look at all the policy, all the law, all the institutional practice where I could find evidence of that. So I went through legislation that aims to protect women from gender violence, where it's criminalized. I then examined institutional practice, how well those laws are implemented. I looked at court rulings, all those types of things, and thought about the ways in which all that institutional practice at the national scale operates. But what I was really more interested in was women's experience of those institutions, whether they provided women who are exposed to violence with meaningful protection or not. So while the first question was kind of a context setting question, what I was really interested in was what women do when they're exposed to this violence. Do they see those institutions at the national level to be important, or are there other things that are more important that helps them find protection from gender violence? So to do that work, and particularly to answer question 2, is where I had to be very careful, because I was working in local communities. When I say that, I worked with or gathered information from about 100 women who participated in my study in each case study site. So about 300 people altogether. And these are some of the things I was worried about in terms of the ethical principles, and this influenced my the design of my case study. So the first one is that, okay, I'm from outside the country. I'm not a Pacific Islander. I've worked in the Pacific Islands for a long time, but I'm not from there. So I needed to be able to think about, how do local people experience this type of research project and also this phenomenon? So what does it mean if I come in and ask these kind of questions, but also how are we talking about this kind of violence when it's occurring in Pacific Island communities? And what I was really concerned about was not replicating a view that is very prominent in certain, when people talk about the Pacific Islands as a very dangerous place for women because there are high rates of violence. I didn't want to replicate that idea that women are just victims of violence and nothing else. They don't have other dimensions to their lives. So I wanted to be careful to develop a study that captured also how women respond and their agency, which is it's a bit of an academic word there, but not just treating them as victims, also treating them as survivors is, I guess, the way to put it. So I'm not just creating this kind of victimized lens and this victimized perspective of Pacific Island women as exposed to violence. And there's been a lot of work that I felt did that too much. And I know that that has been a cause of concern for some Pacific Island people. One of our participants in today talked about backlash, and this is a real problem, right? And again, it's because of the stigma of gender violence, right? It's an issue that has a lot of stigma attached. So I, as a researcher, had to navigate a way of investigating this issue that didn't cause backlash against me or other members of the research team, because I worked closely with local people to help me do the study. And I was really concerned that they might be targeted, the people who were helping me, the women's organizations who agreed to help me, that they might be targeted by people who didn't want the study to go ahead, whether that be at the community level or at the national level. And there's been experiences where even the president of Bougainville threatened to throw the United Nations out of that territory because they had produced a study on gender violence, which showed very high rates of gender violence. And he was really concerned about how that reflected on his community. There were some problems with the methodology of that study, I will say that. But also, part of the problem was they didn't negotiate the protocols very well, and they didn't present the findings of the study in a way that was sensitive to those kind of dynamics as well. Also, the third sort of risk attached to this research was the harms of mistranslation, both in a cultural sense and a linguistic sense. I was working across many different language groups. There are lots of internal to each Pacific Island country. There are many, many different language groups. But then, and English sometimes is a lingua franca, but not always. French is spoken in New Caledonia. So I was sort of working across a very intense amount of linguistic diversity and cultural diversity, which meant that even if I asked quite simple questions, I could never really be sure that everyone understood what I was asking. And, a lot of communities that you work with in Pacific Island countries, and it's the same in many parts of the country, they don't have many parts of the globe, they don't necessarily have very high levels of education. They may have completed primary school and maybe a couple of levels of high school these days. But, it's not as if there's high levels of literacy in the, amongst the groups of women that I wanted to speak to. So I wanted to develop a research methodology where I could I could be quite sure that people were understanding what I was asking them, or what we were asking them. And then again, this picks up on another point that was raised by in our discussion earlier by you, and the thoughts you had on ethical approaches to research. And that is, as I mentioned before, this challenge of trauma. We really need to be careful to ensure that our participants are not exposed to trauma when we're doing this kind of work focused on, the child marriage example was fantastic. Violence against women again. We don't want to trigger people into revisiting traumatic experiences that they've had in the past as researchers. That is an unethical research process. So we need to make sure that we limit the potential for that, but also that we have very good support protocols in place, that if someone becomes emotional or seems to be impacted by trauma as through participation in our study, we have the supports there to ensure they get the assistance that they need. So to get around all of this, what I decided was to develop what I called a photo elicitation study. So rather than asking people questions directly about their own experience, what I did was work with a photographer and a group of actors in one of the countries that I conducted this study in, Fiji. And we developed little scenarios and took photographs of them and used those as the basis of the discussion to find out the information that I wanted to find out in relation to what women do when they are exposed to violence in these communities. So photo elicitation is one type of research strategy that you can do. It takes the form a little bit like an interview, but you present the person you're speaking to with an image and you ask them about what they see in the image. And you can pose questions to them still, but they're looking at an image. So both you and the participant are looking at the image, and together you're trying to work out what they see in the image, right? So they explain to you what they see in the image, and each time they do that, you learn something from them. So it's a very nice way of developing an engagement with a study participant that kind of moderates the power differentials a little bit. You show them the image, and sometimes, you know, rather than just asking a direct question, they're actually teaching you about what they see in the image. The reason why I chose this approach was because, to begin with, I thought, well, this is a way of ensuring that I'm not asking people directly about their experiences, but more about to kind of make the discussion more abstract about what happens in their communities, for example. But rather than saying, oh, you know, if you were exposed to violence, what would you do? How helpful do you think the police are? How helpful do you think chiefly authorities are in your community? How helpful do you think religious leaders are? Rather than doing that, I could just say, oh, what do you think is happening in this scenario? Who do you think is responsible for this situation? If it resulted in some kind of violence, what could the woman do? Where could she go for help? How helpful do you think they would be to her? So it opened up the discussion away from personal experience to thinking about these ideas in much more abstract form and to think about practice in the community. And what we found is that actually this made the likelihood of people, you know, talking about gender violence and then becoming traumatized by their experiences. As I'll explain in a minute, sometimes people shared personal experiences, but they were never strongly emotional when they did. That's not to say that images can't be traumatic to look at. So we were very careful to construct the images in a way that didn't show violence, but they showed tension in relationships. And then we asked people about what they thought might happen in those tense relationships. I'll show you a little bit what I mean in a minute. I've got some examples of the images that I used. How did I develop the images? So, as I said, I worked with a photographer who was actually a former student of mine. She was a journalism student, so she came with me to Fiji to do this work. And as I said, we worked with a group of actors who I'd known for many years, and they helped me sort of develop the scenarios. They were a community-based theatre that did a lot of work on trying to challenge gender violence in their communities and questions around gender justice, the promotion of gender justice. But we just kind of developed scenarios. So I looked at all the literature I could on gender violence and studies of gender violence that was focused on, you know, the types of things, the tensions that can cause gender violence in families. And then we tried to think about, well, what would those tensions be like in Pacific Island communities? And we came up with little kind of scenarios that we acted out in all different sorts of settings. So it might be, you know, challenges around gendered expectations of who does household work. And so we photographed that in a squatter settlement, a small house in a squatter settlement. We did things like who has tensions around who has the right to spend money in a relationship. And we developed a little scenario in a more middle-class house. We looked at women's right to engage in sort of social activity outside the home, men's rights to, engage in social activity outside the home, because we know often that's where tensions occur, right? When women go out with friends or men go out with friends and, consume too much alcohol, they're big tension points often in relationships. So we wanted to capture those ideas, but not show the violence, just show the idea. Suspicions about conjugal fidelity, right? Are people being faithful to each other, or are they, engaging in extramarital relationships, that kinds of thing. Again, we know that those are causes of tension in communities. Women's ability to move with autonomy in the community. Are they able to move around safely, catch public transport safely? And then are they able to negotiate either safe sex or sexual autonomy in their relationships? So these are actually some of these questions, particularly the last one, very sensitive issues. But as I hope I can convince you, with this methodology, we found we had some really incredible responses from people. So I've just got a couple of images there of, the type of work we did, working with local communities, and my photographer. I mean, I could have taken the photos myself, but she was trained in photography, so she did a much better job than I did. I'm going to talk a little bit about a way you could develop this approach yourselves, just using your own kind of access to technology. In a minute. You don't need to have a photographer if you don't want. But I want to show you some of the images that we used. So as you can see, there is no violence. We were very careful that we didn't want to show violence. And even sometimes the images looked like, how can I put it? The tension was too explicit, and I was worried that would be traumatizing for people. So some images we couldn't use. But we just wanted to create the idea of tension in a relationship. So we used images like this to get at the idea of suspicion of infidelity, challenges around who takes care of gendered roles, and what, the gendered labor expectations is the way I would put it, and how these might, when these, either the woman or the man is not seen to be doing what's expected, could be the cause of tension. Women moving around the community with autonomy. And we wanted to get at an intersectional dynamic here. So a younger woman, a young schoolgirl, and an older woman. Women dressing appropriately or inappropriately. We know, often there's that victim blaming mentality that if women dress in a certain way, then they maybe they're asking for exposure to gender violence. That's an idea that's, often used as a justification for women being exposed to some kind of assault. Women's right to spend money, men's right to spend money, let me change that. Women's right to spend money, men's expectations about, or gendered expectations about who is the breadwinner in the community, and then also women's ability to ask for money if they're not the breadwinner. And then women's roles as decision makers. Are they able to safely participate in community meetings? So all these ideas, all these images were shown to our study participants, and we gathered their responses to these images. And we asked questions like, I'll skip over these because I'm worried about running out of time. So we asked women to look at the photographs, and then we asked them questions about, did they think the woman in the image was safe? Why or why not? What made her safe or unsafe? And who was responsible for her insecurity? And, we were encouraging them to think about, what kind of insecurity would she face? And then what could she do to achieve safety? Like, where would she what kind of authorities could she access if she wanted somehow to get help in that particular situation. I worked with, I'm going to talk a little bit about findings in a minute, but mainly it's the methodology. I mean, I'm sure you're quite interested in the findings, but maybe it's mainly the methodology I want to talk about today. So just to say that I couldn't do this work by myself. I actually, of course, needed to work with local collaborators. So there, you know, on the slide is just some images of the people I worked with in each case study site. And I only worked with women's organizations. Why did I do that? Because these were groups who also work in the area of the promotion of gender justice. So they knew what to do if people became traumatized as they responded to these questions, right? So that was very important, that I only worked with women. I only worked with women and we only worked in communities where these groups were known, so that there was a lot of trust. And I wasn't coming in as an outsider and just asking questions of people and they had no context. Because I worked with these local communities, they trusted these organizations, and because these organizations trusted me, they were quite happy to participate in the study. So that was a very good way of working on this sort of project. So let's just return to those harms that I talked about, the idea of, you know, how do we, first of all, the challenge of making sure that you're not creating these really stigmatizing portraits of Pacific Island societies as places where people are just victimized all the time by gender violence and they can't do anything about it. What my research ultimately found was a way of talking about how women respond, and this was totally unexpected for me. But what emerged from the study is that although women don't actually see policing and all the national levels of regulation of gender violence and gender security as very helpful to them, they had other ways of thinking about what they could do to make themselves safe. So while they might say, oh, you know, it's the woman's fault because that she's exposed to this violence because she spent too much money, clearly, or, you know, she's going out to work and earning more money than her husband. You know, curiously, that was seen as a cause of gender violence often. There were also often women who would say, no, this is wrong. This goes against how things should be in our society, and our voices need to be heard more by the decision makers in our communities. Our voices need to be heard by our chiefs. They need to be heard by the religious leaders, and we need to be more supported so that they understand how our society should work and the gendered rules of our society. Because at the moment, those gendered rules in sort of cultural practice and customary practice is very important in the Pacific. At the moment, they're being ignored. So this was quite unexpected for me, because I sort of thought maybe people would say, oh, they need to go to the police, women need to go to the police, but, you know, they just don't understand enough about the law. But actually, they rarely spoke about the police as a source of protection. And they were much more likely to talk about, you know, where and how their own understandings of what is right in custom should protect them from violence. So that was exciting for me. And it showed that there are these other regulatory practices happening in these communities that can protect women. In terms of the backlash component, we rarely face backlash. So we spoke often about the study as a study on safety, women's experiences of safety. We never used the term gender violence. And even with the women, when they participated in the study, we never asked them questions about gendered violence. As you recall, we'd ask questions about safety. Do you think the woman's safe? So what our thinking there is if they go back home and someone says, oh, what did you do today? What was happening at that meeting? They could say, oh, we spoke about women's safety. We didn't, and there was no way that anybody could talk about gender violence then, or or we hoped at least that that wouldn't be that wouldn't be the discussion. Of course, sometimes people did, they used those terms, but the way we framed the study, both with all the authorities that we had to negotiate access in some villages to, or the women themselves, we only ever spoke about safety. On the whole, on the harm of translation and mistranslation, as I said, because we used images as the basis for the discussion and as the basis for the questions, it was really easy for people to participate. They would either participate in their own language, and then, the people that were helping me were writing in English, translating as they went and writing down the responses. However, they often did respond in English because it was easy for them to speak in English about the images, rather than perhaps it would be speaking about their own experience or things that they had to imagine. They were looking at a picture so they could sort of talk about or it triggered that, not triggered, but it gave them ideas about how to speak about this phenomena. One respondent said to us, "I see the picture, plenty words come," which I think is really nice. It kind of gets at the idea that the image really provoked discussion. Another lady said she wanted all the images to take to her village meeting so she could talk to her chiefs about how bad the problem was in her community. And she said the problem is our stories are our own. Nobody comes and asks us about this stuff. So that was also, I think, a validation of the approach as a really productive one for research. And then lastly, just on this trauma issue, because I think it is an important one. And for this project, what we found is that no matter how carefully you design a study on gender violence, there will always be people who tell you about their personal experiences. That is well recognized in the literature in this area. However, and that was our case, that was our experience too. It was not common, but it certainly happened. And sometimes when we were engaged in discussions with women who participated in the study, and sometimes, these sessions would go on for an hour and a half. Women had lots of things they wanted to say, not everywhere, but often they were very, very long interviews. And sometimes they kind of sit back after sharing, what they could see in the photograph, and then they'd say, "Actually, this has happened to me." And they'd recount stories of violence. And sometimes they'd say, "I've never told anyone about this." So, we were often surprised by that. But what we found is rarely was it traumatic. And often, most of the time, I checked with everyone we worked with. We never really had strongly emotional responses. But what we did find was that they seemed to be grateful for the chance to talk about it. So it opened a way of talking about these experiences that they'd had that were in fact not traumatizing. So it was an interesting methodology in that sense. We didn't impose the expectation that people should talk about their own experience. They did in a way that felt comfortable to them. And of course, as I said, we were well prepared if people wanted to do anything further with those experiences and seek support in any way. And actually, on some occasions too, interestingly, we had women who admitted to be perpetrators of violence against their own children. So that was also highly unexpected, but really interesting. So again, it shows the ways in which this methodology could work to really open up a space for deliberation. And so, just really to finish off, we've got a bit of time for questions, which is good. But just to say that this has been a work that I've worked on for many years, but I'm super excited to have my new book coming out, which is focused on discusses the results of this massive project that I've done. It was too big. This is a lesson for anyone. Don't design super ambitious projects because you get too much data and you actually have a real struggle to write it up. But I have finished now. And maybe if by the time I get to see you all at the end of August, I might be able to bring a couple of copies of the book to share with you. And I also have a new research publication coming out, Insecurity Dialogue, that talks about the results of the research as well. So I'm super excited to have, you know, the findings from this research coming out and being able to be shared with people. And I'm super excited about the cover of my book too, which is designed by a woman from Fiji, an artist from Fiji, an original artwork. So I just thought, if you don't mind indulging me, I just wanted to share that with you. And also the other great outcome of this research was wonderful friends that I made with all the collaborators who helped me. So that's just some images of some of the amazing women who helped me do this work in, yes, many, many field sites all around these various Pacific Island territories. I did say, and I just want to perhaps stop sharing for a minute and say, okay, that sounds like a very ambitious project. And you might wonder, well, oh, how could I do this for my own research? There is another really interesting way that you can do photo elicitation research, and that is ask study participants themselves to take photos on their phone that might be related to your research study, and then sit with them and ask them to explain the photo to you. So that's called auto elicitation. And it is a very achievable way of doing a similar project. You could prepare images yourself with your phones, of course. I think if I was to do it again, perhaps I might try that myself, because I sort of know a bit how to do it now. But, you know, for example, you might do an image, you might be interested in a study on climate change. And so you could prepare images of, you know, environmental degradation related to climate change, and then ask study participants to reflect on those images. So, you know, it can be as resource intensive or as resource feasible as you want to make it. But the auto elicitation approach is quite a good one too. And then another thing you can do is ask people to keep a different kind of elicitation study. Could be ask people just to keep notes on their day, that kind of thing. And then you ask them about their diaries, you know, if you want to sort of gather information about people's experiences, maybe as market traders or something like that. That's another kind of elicitation study that you could do. Anyway, just some ideas to help you think about, you know, how these types of research methodologies can be conducted, and the importance of, you know, going back to the question that Tia asked right at the beginning about the robustness of this kind of work. I truly believe that my work is more robust than asking people to respond to a survey. I believe that the answers that we got were so rich in relation to this study and the design of this study, and that would never have been captured in a standard research survey approach. Now, a standard research survey approach would probably survey 1,000 people in each country. All I could manage was 100, as I said, because it took a lot of time. But I do believe that the data I gathered was more robust because of it was so rich. Anyway, I'm going to stop now, and I'm really interested to hear your responses or if you have any questions.
We got a few questions here in the chat box already on photo elicitation thing. So the first question, how can we design this type of question or case or scenario interview like that for that photo thing? And then Rata shared about her experience. And the other question from Sommi is, could we use photo elicitation alone, or what other methods that we could use together with photo elicitation? For instance, interview, FTD, or observation?
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Great questions. Rata, you've been in Bougainville in Fiji. Thank you. Oh, that's lovely to know. Sometimes I feel, oh, are these sites a little bit, you know, what's the word? You know, quite far from Cambodian experience. Actually, there are probably many things that are similar, but And Solomon Islands. Wow, you're very well traveled. That's great. I can't wait to chat more in person about your experiences in the Pacific. So good to know I'm not sort of speaking about a context that nobody understands. As I said, I'm sure there are many things that are quite clear. And in fact, I've read some very good research on gender violence and the regulation of gender violence in Cambodia. And I think some of the challenges may be quite similar in terms of the ways in which experiences that happen in very local sites and the distance between those sites and national systems of regulatory authority. So I think some of the dynamics might be quite similar, actually. How can we design this type of question or case or scenario interview? Well, as I said earlier, I think sometimes we have to get out of our comfort zone a little bit and think, as I said, you know, like with climate change, for example, I can imagine a scenario where you could prepare some images yourself and ask people to speak about them, or you could find images that are already prepared, you know, select a group of images that maybe capture a dynamic that you're interested in. They might be newspaper images or images in the media and ask people to respond to them, or that auto-ethnographic, no, not auto-ethnographic, auto-elicitation approach, where you ask people to take photographs. You know, if you're interested, for example, in, oh, what could I say? Let's go back to the market traders example. You know, let's try a different one. This is a gendered example. It can be modified, but, you know, how do people balance the requirements to work outside the home with the obligations of working inside the home? And ask people to take images of that, of their day. You know, maybe you say, take one image every day for a week, which captures some element of that, how you understand balancing those obligations, and then ask them to talk about it. And, you know, if you did that with 5 people, you'd have 25 images. I think it would produce some really interesting discussion. And you might have to pilot it. That's the other thing to say. Often this work, we're not sure how well it will go. So it's important to pilot. And you might think, okay, I could do this work with maybe 2 people. And let's see if I can develop out of that a standard set of questions that I could ask each person when they show me their images. So often it's a bit experimental to get it right at the start. What I learned from my own study was don't have too many images. With those interviews, I had 18 images. It was ridiculous. That's why the discussion went for so long. And often I would have 2 or 3 images on the same theme. That was a mistake. You know, I did a more streamlined version of this study in Vanuatu some years later, and I only used 10 images, and we got just as rich information. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Siniat, exactly, but certainly happy for a follow-up question. Could we use photo elicitation alone? I think it's important actually to triangulate. So as I said, with my work, I did both photo elicitation and interviews with policymakers and policy implementers on gender violence. Because, as I said, I wanted to understand, what does this realm of regulation on gender violence look like at the national level? And how does, even if we have the laws, because, you know, my sense is in every country in the world, where there are good laws in place, they're not well implemented. It's the same in Australia. We have more and more laws on gender violence and, you know, that are supposed to protect women from this violence. But we still know women go into police stations to make complaints about the violence and are sent home back to abusive partners. That happens in Australia, happens all around the world. So I know that, you know, I'm quite skeptical about the value of the national process, but nonetheless, I needed to know what it was. And I wanted to interview people about that process and what they thought worked well and what they thought didn't work well. So I certainly did interviews to understand the national realm. But then I was really interested in the bottom-up experience and how those two things meet, which is why then I also did the photo elicitation study. But what I think, in answer to your question, or to answer your question another way, Somani, I would say it would be really interesting to do focus group discussions in relation to images as well, and to see how groups discuss a particular image. With all the, with all the challenges of focus groups that I mentioned previously, I also would like to do that. I think it would be really interesting. What about when the studied groups are politicians? So, Sophia, maybe are you asking if we could do photo elicitation with politicians? Is that your question?
Hi, Sophia. Are you trying to talk? We can hear you, Sophia.
Oh, sorry, Sophia. Yeah, we can't. Sorry, I think your mic may not be working. I'm sorry, Sophia. I'm not sure if I'm understanding that question. Maybe if you could add a little bit more in the chat to that, that would be great. So I make sure I'm understanding you properly. What's the next question here? Lena? How can we involve passive participants? Yeah, look, this is a great question. So in FGD, so in focus group discussion, some participants dominate the discussion while others are more passive. How can we involve passive participants? Yeah, I think we can try, right? So, sometimes I would use my best classroom strategy, which would be, oh, well, we've heard a lot from this part of the room. So is there anyone from this other side of the room that might like to say something? However, it can be hard, right? So you can do that, but even so, those dynamics might be, those social dynamics that I mentioned at the start might be challenging. The other thing to do is develop focus groups that target particular sections of the community. So you might have a group where you only have young women together, for example. Sometimes there's a real value in having a mixed group, and then you complement that by saying, okay, I'm going to take a group of, young women, 15 to 18, for example, or, to maybe if you notice those dynamics and see if you get a different response there. And that's really interesting then in terms of triangulation. So that might be a way, like pilot with some mixed groups and then see if you can, if those dynamics are apparent to you, to develop, to structure your focus groups in a more targeted way. So you recruit particular groups from the community. So that might be a way of doing it. If your classroom tactic of, could we make the people who want to say everything be quiet for a minute and make space for some other people to say something?
Nicole, can I have a follow-up question a bit?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yes. So like you mentioned that we heard a lot from this group, and then are there any insight from this group? But I just wonder, can we ask directly to the person that they are not talking, or is it it's got again their willingness to participate?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can, of course you can. I'm one of those people that I sometimes feel uncomfortable doing that. I think sometimes you certainly can. It's just not in my way of interacting with people. I sometimes feel like I don't want to put pressure on them to speak if they don't want to speak. Like, is there some reason that they don't want to speak? But that's just me personally. I think you certainly can. But then maybe people will speak in a way that they feel they're expected to speak. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, it's a challenging one. It's a challenging one. I don't think it hurts. And presumably, maybe if you're paying for people's time, then you sort of feel like, well, I would really like to hear you say something. I can understand why people would do it. But I think maybe a way around that, as I said, is to structure your focus groups, to have some mixed groups that are more randomly put together, and then have some very targeted groups as well. We will talk about this more. I think GB will be talking about this more when he discusses the session, when he leads the session next week on interviews as well.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
No, my pleasure. Now, there is a long question here. I'm going to read this out. I'm really sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly. Chingnim Kwok. Using images as a basis for discussion in research is interesting and can provide valuable insights, but carries risks of harm, particularly when involving, even if consent has been obtained to use those images. Have you experienced any challenges or concerns relating to this? How do you ensure that the use of images does not cause harm or backlash for the participants of communities involved? Thank you. So for this, for the exercise I did, they were all actors. So they were already kind of performers, and they didn't, you know, I didn't take photographs in communities where people were unsuspecting in any way. Like, these people were all performers. They knew kind of what they were getting into. They'd already played parts like this, in fact, sometimes much tougher, sort of on social issues. So they weren't worried about backlash. And at the same time, as I said, we really were very careful about not showing any violence. But I think you're absolutely right. If you're not careful, you could potentially create situations where you're exposing people if you haven't got consent. And people sometimes give consent without understanding what they're consenting to. So it's also important for you as a researcher to really be thinking carefully about, just because someone says yes, you could actually still get them into problems, right? So I think this is a great question. And I think it really requires you, again, to be thinking about risk. So that's why I raised that right at the start today, is, you know, risk, thinking about the risks that you can generate with your work is very important. But, you know, also, and I mean, this is a criticism that I've received of the book. I haven't shown any of the images in the book. And that's because, you know, I talk about the results, and I have some of those images on that little website that I shared with you. But generally, you know, most of the images are not going to be seen by members of the public, because I don't, you know, the general public, I don't think it's really appropriate. It was a research tool, and I feel like I've given enough description. So I show the very gentle ones, but there's other ones that I just don't think are appropriate. So I guess you have to use your judgment a little bit there, is what I would say. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Now, another question. Instead of working with local organizations to win trust of the community, are there any other ways you would suggest? Yeah. Yeah, this is a hard one. I mean, this is always my way of sort of doing the work, is working with local trusted people, NGOs, non-government organizations, but really local ones, right? Yeah, let me reflect on that a little bit more. I think it depends on the sensitivity of your questions, you know, but also to gain access, because people often complain about being over-researched, don't they? And so, you know, there's a bit of research fatigue and suspicion about researchers. So I do feel like working with local stakeholders that are trusted is a really important way to do this kind of work. Particularly if we're talking about inclusive social research. So yeah, I perhaps it would be interesting. It's a shame DB isn't here, because he's done a lot of similar sorts of research in Nepal, working through local trusted communities. I mean, there is a challenge with this too, because you can get what you may have to navigate what we also call gatekeeping. So your trusted organization may direct you into certain places and not to other places as well. So, you know, nothing is ever perfect, is what I would say to you. We do the best that we can, but we do need to be careful that sometimes local organizations can actually be gatekeepers, and it may mean that, you know, they steer you into areas where they know the people will tell you a particular kind of story, but they steer you away from communities where perhaps they're not so well accepted, or they're worried how the community might respond to your questions, or they might respond in a way that the gatekeeper doesn't agree with. So yeah, I think you raise an interesting dynamic there. I'm not quite sure how to answer it, but yeah, I'll reflect on it a bit more. Ask DB about this next week too. I think it'll be good. Oh, okay, Sophia, I see your question here. Could this photo elicitation be used with politicians with greater power dynamics? Look, I think it could. The problem with people in positions of power is, you know, everyone wants to interview them. So to be asked to do something like this is a bit outside their experience. And while some might really love that, some might think, oh, this is a bit trivial. What is this about? You know, so I think you again raise a really interesting question. Politicians are very comfortable with being interviewed. Unlike the stakeholders I was working with, the people, the study participants who I felt everyday women, often in rural communities or living in squatter settlements, or, you know, living in quite humble sort of circumstances, I felt that they would maybe very uncomfortable with being interviewed. So I guess my question back to you would be something like, what would be the benefit of using this research methodology with someone who is very comfortable with being interviewed? Now, it might be that they tell you something different that they haven't told anyone before. And that would be a dividend for research, because we also know politicians, they're comfortable with being interviewed, and they're also comfortable with sharing a particular kind of truth, right? So you might get a really new set of perspectives, because they might be caught a bit off guard by this kind of methodology. I can't guarantee it, but, you know, it could be a way of getting at a different kind of information from a politician than the standard narrative, which is always they tell you what they think will make them look great, right? So I'm being a bit cheeky there, but I think that might be a potential benefit. But I think the problem is they may be slightly questioning about why you would want to do this kind of thing with them when you first approach them. But yeah, it's a good question. This is perfect timing. I think we've come to the end of the questions, and it's 2:56. So, oh no, well, it's 2:56 here in Brisbane. I think it might be 11:56 where you all are, and you're probably starving for your lunch. So I don't want to keep you from that. But Kim-san, do you want to say anything? Thank you for your engagement, everyone. I've really enjoyed sharing this session.
Not much. Just thank you, Nico. I think today you worked very hard. A lot of interesting questions, and thank you for sharing your research experience, especially this innovative research method. I think it's opened up our mind. It breaks the circle of, you know, the standard
Yeah.
research that I used to hear, at least in my case. So I think, yeah, I think it's good to explore, you know, and explore new method and hear more about it. And I think everyone should, you know, should try to at least to think about, you know, a new research method. And because for me, all it matters is that we can, you know, answer, you know, our research questions. That's for me, you know, when I do research, my focus really whether I can answer my research questions. And
Yeah.
so it doesn't matter if I use, it doesn't matter, you know, if what tool I use, as long as it's ethically okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
No, you're right. You're right. The design has to respond to the question. If you can get the information you need in a particular way, then that's fine. But I agree, you know, the research, our job is to answer our research questions. Absolutely.
yeah. So without further ado, I would like to I forget the term. Maybe I'm too hungry for lunch. Anyway, nothing else to say. Just wish everyone a happy weekend and enjoy your lunch for those in Cambodia, and also for those in Australia, enjoy your evening soon. Yeah. See you next week, and I will keep you updated for the preparations, especially for the interview session with the DP. Have a nice weekend, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.